And now let's move on to paper 2 and the approaches. Now, what's important for basically paper 2 and paper 3, they are pretty much identical in the way that you approach them, because there's no difference really. Paper 3 simply requires you to use specific people or specific individuals or specific countries, but the core idea is exactly the same as a paper 2 essay. So you shouldn't really treat it differently. So when writing your paper 2, I recommend that you put your main ideas down first of all, right? Because it's just easy. Don't be free to waste as much paper as you want. The IB will give you more paper. Don't worry about it. Just put down those general ideas, just very generally, so that you know what you're writing about, so that you have like that thing to base your structure off of. And I'm telling you this as someone who, in general, really does not like to make any like plans, and I always just sit down and I write whatever. But for this context, it's a good strategy, because if you ever just like stuck on a moment, you can quickly look back up to this piece of paper and then remember what you were thinking about initially, right? So that's the thing. I also recommend that you, for example, for paper 1, you can mark the midway point. Sorry, for paper 2, you can mark the midway point, so that you know like around when you should be finishing up your first essay. And also, if you finish early, how much or late, how much time do you have extra or less for the other essay. For paper 3, you can do the same thing, basically just divide it into 3 times. So that's a pretty useful thing to do, which is why I have 240 written on this piece of paper. And what about the actual approach? So obviously you put the introduction where nail down the main points you're probably going to be talking about in your 3 paragraphs, because normally you go for 3 paragraphs. If you write 3 paragraphs and you find that you have more time, then yeah, you can put a 4th shorter paragraph, or maybe even other shorter paragraphs before moving into the conclusion, right? So what is the approach for these paragraphs? And the thing that you should do is try to make sure that you have an integrated approach. Like, for example, first of all, some people will argue that it's usually best to write like an argument for, another argument for your point, and then like a counter argument with like a, that's against, right? But I would say that that's not actually the best approach to your paper 2 essays, because there's a better way to do it. You can simply integrate counter arguments into every single one of your paragraphs. So you write something like, and you're just like whatever, and then you say like, on the other hand, there's also this thing that's worth considering, but then again, this. So you can even bring up a counter argument to your counter argument, and that, strengthens your own main point. So I always advocate for having that integrated approach. Now, a lot of people would also support having an ambiguous conclusion, so that one way you can make sure that you're hitting both sides of the argument, that you're considering both perspectives to IB satisfaction, is by making sure that you have a balanced conclusion where it's like, well, you know what, who knows really, where it's like doesn't really make any strong statement. But I personally believe that you're better off just writing whatever you believe in. And the reason is that if you're writing about what you believe in, then it's going to be easier for you to find good points for it and to find many points for it. And as long as you guys are capable of effectively integrating those counter arguments into each of your paragraphs, because there's always like some like nuance or some caveat to be found somewhere, then in this situation, you guys will still have that balanced approach where you guys are considering and analyzing these counter arguments. And as a matter of fact, when you're countering a counter argument, then first of all, you're also showing that you've deeply considered it, and second of all, you're strengthening the point that you're trying to make. So if you guys know how to write this effectively, it's perfectly fine to have a very strong opinion on something. if as long as you can consider those different perspectives, that can still work very well. So yeah. Another thing is, of course, introducing your own knowledge. So obviously you want to put in dates whenever you can to integrate the chat, like the deep knowledge. So put in and name drop the institutions like the KGB. Put in the dates for various events like the Cuban Missile Crisis. Bring up the views of like different historians. That's another thing, right? Currently in the IB, you are no longer required to name drop historians, because the IB decided that students were spending too much time memorizing historians, and the IB decided that instead it's a better idea to just only require you to memorize the view of a specific school. But I generally disagree with that, because I believe that it's easier to memorize a historian for two reasons. First of all, schools are very broad, and it's often very hard to like tie in a specific historian to a specific school. His views may be on the edge of a school, or like on the border between two schools, or be completely out there, or just like hard to relate to. And second of all, if you can tie like a historian to a point, it's just easy to remember. Especially like, and another thing is like, don't memorize quotes from books or historians. Memorize the idea and rewrite their general idea in your own words. Because by not quoting them and putting it in your own words, you're showing that you understand what the historian is saying, and you don't need to quote them because you actually understand what they're saying. And second of all, if you put it into your own words, like when you're studying and you put it down yourself somewhere earlier, then it's easier for you to remember. Because remembering your own words that you write down is just always easier than memorizing quotes. And that's my point there. Of course, if you guys weren't memorizing historians, if you were just memorizing schools, that's a valid approach. Continue to do that. You have 2 weeks left, so it's probably not a good idea to just completely change the approach. Although probably learning the views of 2 or 3 historians which are relevant wouldn't hurt. But yeah, you could. Don't worry about it. You can continue with schools. That is considered completely acceptable by the International Baccalaureate. And yeah, so those are my general points. And now also about how you write paragraphs, because you might get paragraphs. For example, you want to make sure that everything you write about is based around not like specific events or something very specific, but rather you want to go into areas. So for example, you're talking about foreign policy. So consider first its impact on the economy, then its impact on international relations of like some sort of on like relations with other states, then the impact on domestic society and or politics. It could be a separate paragraph. Let's say an influence on military or hard power, right? So go by these topic areas, and this should be extended not only to the questions where it's obvious, but I'd argue that's also should be extended to the questions where the IB requires you to compare two things. So for example, where the questions are like, consider the role of 2 Cold War leaders in the development of the early Cold War, and then they give you like a date range. Or consider the impact of World War II on 2 countries in different regions. Don't let's say you choose Germany and Japan. Don't do a paragraph on Germany and then a paragraph on Japan, because after that it's hard to give that joint conclusion, because you need a separate paragraph which just concludes that section for those countries, and it's like you're analyzing them completely separately, and the IB doesn't like that. Instead, also you should continue by areas. So consider what was the role that they played in, played in their economies, that played in their politics, that played in their societies. Compare and contrast for both Germany and Japan in that area in one paragraph, then move on to the next, then move on to another. Make sure it's integrated. Same with names when you have leaders, right? Like let's say Khrushchev and Truman. Consider what they were doing for the economy for the global economy. Consider that in one paragraph. Then consider, how their actions affected their support, at home or their domestic societies. Consider that. Then consider, how they were changing the shape of international relations. Put that in one paragraph. Do not consider them separately, because that is just not the way to go. It's not going to be looked at as favorably by the IB. And I mean, and by forcing yourself to always compare and contrast them within each paragraph, you are forced to have a balanced analysis and then have that element of analysis beyond just description. And and you can also extend that even to when you have those rare questions, which actually discuss the long-term and short-term effects of something. You should take, I argue that the same approach can be good. Of course, here it's a good idea to do long-term, short-term, but not necessarily medium-term. You can do that, but you can also go by like area. So for example, let's say like I don't know, World War II. Economic reasons for or let's say the economic reasons for the rise of Hitler, right? Or you have a question, compare, consider the long and short-term causes of Hitler's rise to power. Then you can make a topic about the economy. Talk about the long-term underlying influences, right? So World War I, reparations, all these crises, and then short-term, the most immediate reparations of the Great Depression. And then you can consider the relative importance of each one of them, right? I mean, was the long-term cause by itself strong enough to significantly contribute to it? Or would it have been not that big of a deal if it wasn't for this immediate short-term cause? You can also go by area here. Because at the end of the day, guys, you need to remember that the IB essentially has three types of questions. Some people will ask you to memorize, like some teachers, all the difference between evaluate or analyze or consider or discuss. At the end of the day, the IB wants pretty much the exact same thing from you for all of those questions. Like for an example, Kohl's support for the rapid reunification of Germany was motivated by political opportunism, right? To what extent do you agree with the statement? That's the IB question, but it could easily, to what extent do you agree with the statement, could easily be, replaced with discuss. Because if you put discuss, the IB is still going to expect that you analyze to what extent this statement is true, to what extent it should be agreed with. The only difference it's going to make is that you're not going to write that one sentence which says, oh, I agree to this extent, or I disagree to this extent. You're just going to avoid that. You're just going to have that discussion. And this could be also rephrased as evaluate, analyze the impact of Kohl's support for the rapid reunification of Germany. Evaluate the impact of political opportunism on Kohl's support for the rapid reunification of Germany. Stuff like that. You can rephrase it. At the end of the day, you guys are still answering the same question. That's important to remember. And even when you have the two other types of questions, the other two types of questions are the one where you have to compare and contrast two things. So instead of just looking at one cause or one guy, or the multiple causes for one thing, you guys have to actively, as I said, look at two countries or two leaders. Eventually, as I said, you guys still have the opportunity to follow the same approach where you go by areas, by economic, social, political, military, etc. And for the final, very rare type of question, where it's consider the long and short-term impacts or causes of something, then it's pretty much exactly the same. Here, it's actually an exception to the general rule, because it can be a good idea to use that different approach and have two big paragraphs, one on short-term and one on long-term causes, or three if you include medium terms. But as I said, it's also a very good approach, arguably even a better one, to also divide it up into those specific sub-areas. So that's the extent of my paper 1 advice. I think those are the big things, really. Does anybody have any more questions or anything? Both about the papers or about literally anything. The Cold War, World War II, the interwar relations, dictators. Does anybody have anything?
Yeah, I know that the papers are going to be the same of the May 2021. I wanted to know how many questions do we have to answer in paper 2 and paper 3? Because I know in paper 1 we have to respond everything, But I know that in paper two and paper three we have to choose something like that.
Oh yeah. So for paper two, you normally choose two questions. When I scanned this, I didn't put all the questions. I only put these two topics, since I chose one question from topic 11 and one question from topic 12. But you guys have to choose one from each topic. So you can't do both Cold War questions, or you can't do both like World War questions, or you can't do both dictator questions. You have to do one from one section and one from the other. And for paper three, this doesn't apply. For paper three, you have to choose three questions. So it's different. You guys can actually choose multiple questions from one section. So you can do like here, two on interwar diplomacy in Europe, or you can, and then one on like, you know, post-war Western Northern Europe, or you can do one out of each of three sections. It depends on you. There isn't this limitation here.
So in paper three we have to choose three questions.
Yes. Paper three, any three questions. Paper two, two questions, but out of different topics.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just also remember, I'm not sure if your like exams are abridged or anything for November. I'm not really up to date with like what the IB is doing specifically. So you guys want to make sure, because I know that earlier they were abridged for some groups where they only like had to write one thing for paper one and two questions for paper two. Sorry.
Yes, I think that in the examinations of May 2021 they did that, but that's why I asked. And they said that not for the people that are going to do in November are the same. So
yeah, I mean, it's a double-edged sword. In my experience, and what I heard from everybody, you always tend to perform better on the first questions you choose, because that's the question which you choose when you first of all have the most energy to write, and second of all, you usually start with the question you feel the strongest about, right? And then your writing evolves over time. But then again, if you really mess up one question, then not having like extra questions, you know, that can be really bad for you. So it's a double-edged sword. There's benefits and negatives to having more or less questions. And I mean, at the end of the day, you still have the same amount of time per question. Anybody else have anything? Nothing at all from anything history related. No? All right then.
we have to. Oh, sorry. We have to study for the dictators for the paper two or paper three.
Wait, could you repeat?
The dictators like Mao and Hitler and stuff. We have to know for paper two or paper three.
You know them for both.
Oh, okay.
I mean, yeah. Paper 3 is literally just paper 2, but they tell you which people specifically to talk about.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So it's like discuss the impact on Germany and Japan, and not discuss the impact on two countries, like paper 2 would say. Alright then, any other questions?